All right. So as to not delay anymore, let me say hello to everyone. My name is Bashan. I am part of the event staff of Politics and Prose. I'd like to welcome you to another PNP Live. Before we begin this event, just have a couple of items I want to mention. The first is that if you would like to ask a question of our author at any time, we would ask for you to place it into the Q&A box, which you can find towards the bottom of your screen. In addition to that, you'll be able to go to the chat section and you'll be able to find a link which will take you directly to the Politics and Prose website, where you can purchase a copy of Forever Free, A True Story of Hope in the Fight for Child Literacy. Forever Free, has been heralded as a memoir and a call to action, an intimate look, at America's long-standing struggle to adequately educate vulnerable children, and it offers valuable insights for affecting change in families, communities, and nationwide. Tracy Swinton Bailey earned a Ph.D. in education with a specialization in language and literacy at the University of South Carolina in 2013. She began her career as a high school English instructor and went on to found Freedom Readers, an after-school and summer literacy program that was designed and implemented to support families in low-income areas and assist children in achieving their academic goals in reading. She is married to award-winning writer Issac J. Bailey and is the mother of 2 children. This event is being held in partnership with Washington Literacy Center. Joining us today from Washington Literacy Center is Mr. Jamie Williams, who is president and CEO of said organization. Without any further ado, I turn the floor over to you two.
So good evening. It is such a pleasure to be here this evening with all of you with Politics and Prose. Thank you so much for this invitation and this opportunity to talk a little bit about my book, Forever Free. I'd like to thank Bashan for that wonderful introduction. And as he mentioned, my book is a memoir and a call to action. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the memoir part of the book before I get into the call to action. In the very beginning of the book, it talks about the way my mom likes to speak about my birth. I don't know about you, but just about a lot of mothers that I've come across like to tell a birth story. And my mom likes to tell people about how loud I was in the nursery. She would go to see me there as an infant, and the nurses told her, you know, there's nothing wrong with your baby. She's just way off in the corner, because whenever we get the other baby settled, she starts to wail and make all this noise, and she's waking everybody up. And so I like to think of myself still as an adult trying to wake everybody up, especially about concerns around literacy. You might think that that's a topic that we've already covered, something that's so obvious, something that's just right there in your face. But literacy is actually something that I think we need to elevate to the top of our list of priorities. We need to place it, we need to give it a high value in our consciousness these days, because there are so many children that are really not getting what they need out of the literacy instruction that we're offering through our educational system. I'll tell you a little bit more about me. I can remember being surrounded by books my entire life. I can't think of a time when I didn't have books at my fingertips and at my disposal. And my father and I had a very important ritual. I'd brush my teeth and I'd put on my nightgown and I'd be in bed, and he would come and read bedtime stories to me before we would kneel next to the bed and we would say prayers. And so I'm not sure where he found these books, but I remember reading lots of Dr. Seuss. I remember reading a book called Lovable Lyle. That was one of my favorites. I remember reading a lot of Berenstain Bears, but I also remember reading this book called There's a Monster at the End of This Book. It was a Sesame Street book. And it featured Grover, the furry Sesame Street monster. And he would say, don't turn the page, because if you turn the page, we'll find the monster. And when we get to the end of the book, we find out that he was actually the monster. And as a child, I can remember being 4 or 5 years old, that cracked me up. It was about the funniest thing that I could think of. And I always asked my father to read it for me again. I don't remember having many books that featured African-American characters, not children's books. But we also had Jet Magazine, we had Ebony Magazine, and we had these reference books that featured African Americans of Excellence, published by the Johnson Publishing Company. So I always understood that that path was available for me. So now that I lead an organization called Freedom Readers, one of the most exciting things that I do is I'm able to research books that are out there and bring them to children so that they can discover them. So for the next couple of minutes, I just want to share some of my favorite children's books that we enjoy at Freedom Readers. Here's the first one I want to share with you. This book is called R.E.S.P.E.C.T. If you're like me, you're excited for the movie about Aretha Franklin's life. I'm looking forward to being able to go and see that in the theater with my mask on. I've been looking forward to seeing Jennifer Hudson play Aretha Franklin for a very long time. And so now we have a children's book that can accompany that experience. A couple of years ago, we actually spent a lot of time looking at the book Hidden Figures. And that movie was also available, and we had conversations around that. So at Freedom Readers, we try to make a connection between what's going on around us, what's current, and we also try to highlight those people in our culture that are really important and have a good story to share. So the second book I want to show you kind of goes along with the first one, because this book is written by Misty Copeland, and it's called Bunheads. It's not necessarily about her life, but in reading this book and listening to her read the book to me, I was able to discover a lot of the words that are just very significant and probably just roll off of her tongue in her ballerina vocabulary. Those words were new to me when I read this book. And when I listened to her read it, it helped me pronounce those words. And that really made me think a lot about something that we do at Freedom Readers for a very specific reason. At the beginning of each one of our meetings, we share a theme song, and that song connects to what we're going to be reading about and what we're going to be talking about. But we play the music of the theme song, and we project the words of that theme song on a screen, or we give it to the young people in a theme book. And we ask them to put their finger on each word as they're listening to the song being played. It reminds me of when I was growing up in the AME church, and they would line hymns during the Sunday service. A pastor or someone else would read out the words of the song, and then I would open my hymn book and I would be able to see those words in the book as the choir was singing the song. And so many of those words that I learned how to pronounce came into my consciousness and into my vocabulary because of that experience in my church. So when I had the opportunity to craft the Freedom Readers program, I made sure that I included that particular aspect. That was something that was important to me and something that I thought would resonate with the young people with whom I was working as well. Here's another book that we love to read. It's called I Am a Kindness Hero. And we talk a lot about what it means to be a productive or just really a person in our society who is making society better. So we have these conversations around what it means to be kind to other people, what it means to be kind to ourselves. And we always challenge the scholars in our program to practice the things that we talk about and read about at Freedom Readers. So I want to show you this book. It's called Kala Mata's Kitchen. And this young woman took a trip with her family to India over the summer. And it talks a lot about cooking and ingredients and the kind of spices that her family would use in the kitchen. So that's why this book is also important to me. So those are just a few of the books that we just really track down, that we purchase for the young people. In a lot of cases, we're exposing them to titles that they may not have seen in school. And one of the things that we love to do is make sure that they have a variety of books that they can choose from. And choice is something that is a very foundational part of what it is that we do with the young people in our program. I'm going to tell you something that I write about in my book for people who are interested in working with young people in their families, young people in their lives. Let's say you're a caregiver, or you're working with a cousin or a niece or a nephew. I want to share with you the 5 R's that we've set up for really working well with kids and improving their literacy skills. The first R is receive. And what we're asking adults to do as they begin to enter into conversations with young people about reading is to just sit and listen to what it is that they are feeling about reading or what their interests are. It doesn't really even have to be a conversation that starts with reading, but you do need to know enough about the child's lived experience to be able to connect with them in a way that's going to be meaningful and significant for them. So we've developed something called an interest inventory, and you can find them online. You can find them a lot of different places, but you can also go to our website to find our interest inventory, and it's included in the book Forever Free as well. Kids tell us about their favorite color, their favorite sports activities, their favorite people, and then we record that on the interest inventory and begin to shape our relationship around literacy based on the information we receive from the young people. The second R is research. Once we know what the kid is really interested in, and we call the kids scholars, once we know what the scholar really likes and what will really spark their interest, then we spend a lot of time researching books that fall within that interest zone. And so if a kid tells us that they really love football and that's the thing they really want to pursue, then we try to find as many books as possible written by football players about the game of football, the rules related to football, stories that are based in a football environment. And we find all of those things to increase the likelihood that we're really going to make a love connection between a scholar and a book. The third R is record. We think it's really important to keep a record of what kids are reading so that we can make observations about the kinds of things that they gravitate to. Is it the book that you recommend, or is it something that they may have encountered in another setting? Is it a specific author that they're really liking? And can we find authors like the ones that they like? Can we get them involved in series of books that they might like and want to read a whole lot of those? The fourth R is read aloud. Even older children need to be read aloud to. Research tells us that kids can begin to hear your voice in their heads as they're building toward their fluency goals. So reading aloud is something that's extremely important in this process. And the fifth R is respond. We believe that reading is a social act. And so when you come across a book or an idea or a concept in a book that really interests you, you want to talk about it. You want to share that with other people. Being married to a writer, I just really have this wonderful opportunity to be able to run to him with books, and he never looks at me funny. He always goes, yeah, that's an interesting idea. I might want to read that. We may want to read books together sometime and talk about them. We invite kids to draw pictures after they've read books. They can write poems after they've read books. And they may also just write a speech related to a book that they've read and that they loved. Those are the things that kind of guide the work that we do. And finally, I just want to tell you exactly what this Freedom Readers thing looks like that I've been talking about. It's a weekly meeting that lasts for about 90 minutes. We started this whole program in 2010 in the community center at the public housing community not too far from where I am right now. The meeting starts with, like I said earlier, the theme song. And then we might move into a video or a picture book related to that particular theme. This summer's theme was, how does your garden grow? because we were able to take some kids outside to a garden and introduce them to some vocabulary words that they may not have known before. We talked about agriculture. We talked about organic farming. We talked about lots of different words that they may not have encountered, but we also gave them the opportunity to pull some weeds out of the garden and to look at all of the different plants. We labeled all of them and talked to the kids about the connection between that agriculture and some of the agriculture that may have taken place with some of their ancestors in West Africa. I come from an area in South Carolina where rice was grown. This is where rice was king. And because rice was grown here, there were many people that were made very wealthy because of that, that rice crop. So talking about agriculture and farming really is a good way for us to connect to the past as well. So after we have that conversation around our vocabulary words and the theme, we set aside 45 minutes for scholars and tutors to read together. A scholar might read something that they are familiar with, something they're comfortable with reading on their reading level. And then a tutor might read to them something that might be above their reading level, but within their interest zone. The last couple of minutes that they spend together, they actually work on a speech. And then the scholar is given the opportunity to come to the front of the room and deliver that speech. So we may have a 5-year-old talking to a group of 40 people, but they've been trained on voice projection and eye contact and how to speak with enthusiasm. So this is the area where we see a lot of our young people grow the most in building their confidence in public speaking, and we're really excited about that. And so the last thing they do before they leave is they stop by the take-home table and they're able to select a book that they're going to take home and read over the time that we're not together. And we find that research tells us that the more books that kids have in their homes, the more likely they are to perform well academically and graduate from high school on time. So we're excited about being able to do that as well. Before I turn this back over to Jimmy and we jump into a conversation, I know he looks like he's anxious to ask me a few questions there. I would like to share with you just a couple of more of the books that we're loving at Freedom Readers, because I just cannot pass up the opportunity to share these wonderful offerings. So here's a book called Hair Love. And I love this book because it really shines a light on the relationship between an African-American father and his daughter, and he learns how to do her hair. And I'm just really excited about giving kids a chance to see those positive images and see themselves reflected in that. The last book I want to share with you is one of my personal favorites these days. It's called Silway, written by Lapita Nyong'o. And this book really resonated with me a lot because the main character in this book talks about what it's like to feel uncomfortable with the way that you look. And she discovers through the pages of the story that it's what's inside that really matters. And in my book, I write a little bit about going through that journey as well. And so to be able to put a book like this in the hands of a young woman who might be experiencing the same thing I did when I was growing up really feels like a privilege and a gift to me. And this entire experience, this opportunity to share my story and this shine a light on what we need to do in terms of literacy is a privilege and an honor to me as well. So thank you for the opportunity. And Jimmy, it's all yours.
And Tracy, thank you very much. So if anyone looked at my LinkedIn page, I spent the weekend reading this, sitting out on my deck. I'm having focus problems, but yeah, there we go. So I ate this book and it was very good. So I don't want to take up too much time. I'm sure people have lots of questions, but let me kick it off. And first of all, I'll talk, Washington Literacy Center, we're on the other end, and that's where Tracy's book is so meaningful. We deal with the ones that got out the gate, where everything she talks about in her book, where the policy decisions went wrong, the education decisions went wrong, the curriculums did not support and reify the teachings that are supposed to be universal. It just didn't happen. So when I read Tracy's book, I was very excited about walking through this experience of her through college, of her through church, and the literacy experiment of church. So, and then she goes policy, and that's what makes this book so wonderful. You see what shaped her, you see all the things in the way she thinks and what led to freedom riders, and then you get into here's the way things should happen. And on our side, like I said, Washington Literacy Center, we work with the people who got out of the gate. I think I saw our board chair, Mary Panetta, pop up here, and we're both in agreement that what we want to do is we're bookends between ourselves and Tracy and what the Washington Literacy Center does. We form the bookends. Tracy wants to make those changes so that we don't have to catch the tragedies and things that happen when people don't get what they need. So Tracy, my question here, what I got was the heavy religious upbringing, the literacy, I call it the literacy event of reading, and then the policy. So looking at where we are, and this is a question about the book and also something that gets current about where we are with COVID, getting the people to read, families, your books that you just showed and walk people through, they build confidence and they make people read, and they're family books. And some of those books we have too, because our adults, when they're learning to read those books and they read through their children. Talk a bit about the policies, failures, or what you see now, and with the social environment, with the protests, and with COVID, and the minds of children now that you're reading to in Freedom Riders. And you can tie that back to the book itself because you have a lot to say there.
Yeah. So you mentioned a lot of things that really are important to me, especially going back to really the foundation that I believe I received in the AME church, in the building of the confidence there. When I think back on that, I can just see the faces of people who were willing me to succeed. So my parents were there pushing for me, but it wasn't just my parents. I felt like in the community where I grew up, everybody was pulling in the same direction and wanted to see me do well. And if I stepped out of line and they knew about it, my parents definitely knew about it before I got back home, because it was a very close-knit community. And so what I think we need to have more of in our schools today is an understanding of what is happening in communities and what is happening in the homes of the kids that we consider to be underperforming. What we have to do is make sure that there's a strong bridge built between where our kids are and where we want them to go. And I don't think that's really going to happen unless we have teachers in the classroom who have a deeper understanding of lived experience. And so that means more than just, I think, reading about particular communities. I think it means establishing relationships with people and just making sure that we understand the difference between, and I write about this in the book a little bit as well, the difference between what we call charity or feeling like we need to go in and fix something that's broken, moving away from a deficit model and moving toward what I call radical care. Radical care is about knowing that as human beings, we all have deficits. We all have something within us that's broken, but we have to come together and walk alongside one another so that we can help each other reach our full potential. You talked about the adults that were learning to read and they read these children's books. But what I love about Freedom Readers is that we invite the same amount of adults as we invite children into the environment. And the adults tell me every time that they learn so much from these books that we share and the conversations that we have around these books. So these books are not really just for children, although we call them children's books. They really spark a lot of deep conversation about ideas and about concepts and the things that we need to be able to wrap our arms around so that our kids are equipped to make our society better.
Nope. I don't know if anyone has a question, but I have one more. There's a particular quote that jumped out at me, and you have, and it starts, I think it's on page 120 of your book.
All right.
Says, "This is what we need of a nation. We need smart, dedicated, strategic people with access to resources to inject innovation into schools that can do a better job of educating the most vulnerable citizens in our society. And then I'll shorten the other one. You said egos have to be swept aside and room has got to be made for the best ideas. I want to hear you talk a little bit about that, because I thought that set an overarching theme for everything you say in the book, but that quote just really resonated with me.
Yeah. Thank you for pulling that out, Jimmy. I appreciate it. I do feel as if sometimes our systems, because they are so entrenched in the way things have always been done in some instances, our systems are just not very flexible. And they are not really open to those ideas that can really turn things around. I write a bit about LeBron James in the book, working in the Cleveland community and kind of just bringing in his resources and combining them with the people who have been doing a lot of thinking about education and what makes reading instruction and education work for our most vulnerable kids. And so we just have to demand that there's more of that, because I think the bureaucracy and the red tape sometimes can really throw up a stop sign or just barriers to bringing in those things that are exciting for kids, exciting for families, and can make a big difference. I mean, we've been having this conversation about education for a long time. And so in order for us to see a change, in order for us to turn a corner, I think we're going to have to do some out of the box thinking. And that's one of the things that COVID forced us to do, to really think about things from a different perspective. Things that we said we would never be able to do happened overnight by necessity. And so going forward, we're going to have to, I think, be willing to embrace more of that kind of out of the box thinking, so that we can reach not only the kids in our schools, but those thousands of kids who have not connected with schools after they shut down last year because of COVID. So there are lots of kids out there who will still need this foundation of good reading experience, good literacy background, but they're not engaging with the school system at all. So how are we going to be able to bridge those gaps and make those things happen? We need legislators, we need educators, we need leaders in our society who are dedicated to doing, like Malcolm X said, getting it done by any means necessary. Whatever it takes, we've got to reach these kids.
No, very good. I see questions, so I want to make sure we do that. And then I'll have a question with you about, really driving that part home about what the legislators do and the funding, and that's different. But I do see a question from Pete Davis to the panelists. He said when he read For Everybody Wins, one of his students insisted on reading Harry Potter, way over his ability to, in English, because he had seen the movie. And so he's asking for suggestions. And I think, so what do you think?
Well, what I would like to do is, first of all, just applaud Pete and congratulate him for being willing to go into that space where he felt like the child needed to go. So in too many instances, I've seen teachers and schools and libraries say, okay, this is your Lexile level. This is your reading level. You've been tested. This is how you read. This is where you read. And you may not check books out of the library or engage with books that are above your Lexile level. But that's where relationships are so important, because that gives you the opportunity to open up a brand new world for a child. I can't tell you how many times I've seen kids who have been labeled as struggling readers come to me and read words like Tyrannosaurus Rex, because they love to learn about dinosaurs. And so if something is interesting to you, I 100% support the opening of those doors and those avenues for young people so that they can find out more about what they're interested in. Audiobooks are another really strong resource. I also want to mention that I had the opportunity to read the audiobook for Forever Free. And that was another kind of experience for me that it was just a different level of literacy in my adult life that I was able to experience. So introducing kids to those audiobooks, showing them videos of authors reading their books that they may not be ready to read on their own, this really prepares them for what they're getting ready to be able to digest and handle independently.
Okay.
So was he asking for recommendations on other books that he could maybe introduce, or was he, what was the specific question?
You know, I wasn't clear just from the question. I don't know
Okay.
if Pete Davis is still on, but it seems like he was asking for other books and ways to level set the kid with things that he thinks might be within his grasp. And Pete, if you're still on here, feel free to clarify on this in typing.
Yeah, definitely. And again, what I would recommend is Pete wants to know if he should suggest other books.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I totally think that you should keep the child engaged in the literacy adventure, in the literacy experience. If he is excited about it, then let's keep that flame going in any way that we can. But let's keep an emphasis on interest as well as an emphasis on reading ability. I think those two things have to be balanced, and you've got to support kids when they're interested in books that are beyond their reading level at the time, but just don't say it's off limits.
Quick question. I know you mentioned a couple of people, Dr. Soto, you mentioned the boys. Your influencers, who was your absolute favorite influencer in terms of the book, the path you took into developing this book? I know your husband probably is one of them, but beyond that.
So if you're asking me about contemporary influences, I'll think about that for a second, but I cannot not talk about Frederick Douglass and the impact that he had on, I just feel like he has so much to say to us that's relevant today. And I think a lot of my work is really based around some of his writings. The title of the book, it comes from one of his quotes. He says, "Once you learn to read, you are forever free. You're free to dream, you're free to explore, free to express yourself, free to verbalize." And so the title of the entire nonprofit, Freedom Readers, comes from that particular idea that once you learn to read, you are forever free. I can't stop thinking about the fact either that he says that knowledge makes a man, or I'm going to add woman, unfit to be a slave. And so once you have knowledge, once you understand more about how the world works, once you understand your own worth in your own place and how things work in the world, then it's difficult for other people to come along and put shackles on you physically or mentally. And so that's why I think that this whole endeavor is so important.
Okay, no, very good. And I tell you one thing, and it looks in my board chair, Mary Panetta's on here, and I think she's going to have a question or two.
Okay.
She popped in, and I think it's great. One other question from Pete, and I think it's a good. He mentions the idea of homes without books, and I'm assuming that matter of fact, I don't assume from reading the book. You grew up with books. I grew up with books. I'm familiar with everybody. Winsell shared an office with them a long time ago. But he also mentioned the absence of books, the absence of internet, the absence of anything that's literal beyond maybe having, television.
Right.
And I think he would like you to talk a little bit more about that. And I want to keep this connected to the book because you mentioned Frederick Douglass, who was a great hero of mine also, but a little bit about Frederick Douglass and his experience. But I see Pete mentioning just the whole idea of these inspirations that you and I draw off, and that Pete probably draws off, and that who's on there, our board chair, draw off of. But what when you grow up and that's not there, and you do talk a little bit about that in the book. You don't go over to the internet as far, but you talk about that in the book. So I want to hear you talk about that void that you're addressing with Freedom Writers.
Yeah, absolutely. So recently we launched a social media campaign where the hashtag was "No More Book Deserts." So when I decided in 2010 that this organization would be a real thing, I wanted to go into low-income communities for a couple reasons. Sometimes when the tutors come to our program, they believe that we choose to target low-income communities because the kids aren't reading on grade level there, but that's really not the motivation behind going into low-income communities. I know that in those communities, there are barriers that might keep kids who are reading above grade level from continuing to read above grade level. And so what we want to do is just add those extra supports. And one of the supports that we offer through our program is those kids picking up those books from the take-home table and building those home libraries. I think home libraries are extremely important. So we spend money on purchasing books like these brand new picture books that could cost $20 to $25, and we give them to kids to take home. We also really encourage families to just get a library card and make sure that you have access to the library and you visit it often. You can just check out books just on your laptop now, and you can read them online. You don't have to physically go to the library every time you want to check out a book. But that is something that does concern me, these book deserts, and we don't need to have them. We need to make sure that every family has a home library so that these kids can have the opportunity to practice more of what they're learning in school in terms of decoding and comprehending and just being able to fall in love with books.
No, very good, very well said. One question, speaking of your conclusion, and I know I'm jumping all over the book, but you hit on another thing, and you really talk about the whole idea of funding. Anyone who's a nonprofit leader, you know, you live by grants and donations and everything else. And what was particularly striking when you talked about the sad thing of finding out a good grant is due, but it was already passed. And then when you talk about the whole political focus on reading and the lack of, and schools struggling for reading, the uneven landscape of reading depending on zip code and parents who augment. Talk a little bit about the struggles that you have in freedom writers of what you do. You're located in a couple of states, and sustainability means really depends on what I call donorability. So
right.
You can talk a little bit about that. That would be great.
Okay, so right now, Freedom Readers is just really operating in the state of South Carolina. So we're in one state and we're in a couple of counties in that state.
Exactly.
Right. And so, the issue of funding, I think I write about it in the book. I call it the Sisyphus effect. It feels like you're pushing a heavy boulder up a mountain. And then when you feel like you're making progress, it kind of rolls back down to the bottom of the hill and you have to start all over again. And so what I really would like to say for people who have access to resources, one of the best things that you can do is you can make introductions for those people who are leading nonprofits. You can make donations, but you can also, if you know about that good grant, go ahead and tell it to the leader of that nonprofit before the deadline rolls around. Make the introductions, and so people can be more upfront and transparent about what it is that they're after. If you look at the research, you'll find that nonprofits that are led by people of color, and especially women of color, are not funded at the same level as their counterparts that are led by mainstream leaders. So what we have to do is be sure that we target those organizations that really need the help, and also invest some time and energy in some capacity building. It's not always that a nonprofit leader knows the language that is spoken in the nonprofit environment and atmosphere. But what we can do is we can make this whole playing field a little bit more level and a little bit more equitable simply by sharing some of that insider information and sitting down with leaders and saying, okay, this is a brilliant, innovative idea. Now I'm going to lead you through the process of getting the funding you need in order to get to the people who need to have their lives transformed. So that is definitely a big part of the work that we do. I am hoping that we'll get to a place where we can focus more on the work and less on the paperwork. That would just be fantastic for me.
Yeah, and I think we all know doing it's like, do I do my job? Do I do my paperwork? Do I do my job? Do I do my paperwork? How do I
Right.
inspire? It is a circle, and the Sisyphus analogy is perfect there. You have a question, and I think you have a fan club at the Washington Literacy Center, and I know you have one with politics and pros, and it looks like you have one with everybody wins too. So Mary Panetta, who's the chair board Washington Literacy Center, she said, "Thank you so much for speaking tonight." She tutors high school students and find that they are often learning and hearing disinformation. For example, about the efficacy and risk of vaccines, but a lot of other issues too. She wants to know, how does she use her role as a tutor to help address critical thinking, but be respectful of the bond between tutor and tutee?
Mary, thank you so much for that question. That's a really wonderful question. So one of the things that we think about at Freedom Readers a lot is something called media literacy. And I'll go back to what Frederick Douglass said about reading making you free, right? But in the age of the internet, we've got so many things circling around that we have to be able to have conversations with, and I think it's important to have this with young kids, about the difference between information that can be really verified and validated and information that's just out there. I mean, anybody can set up a web page, anybody can go on Facebook and start saying things, but what does it mean to find out that something actually has some evidence to back it up? Mary, I want to say to you that that relationship that you build between the young person that you're tutoring really positions you to be able to talk about things from a perspective where they can hear you and where they can trust you. But I don't think that those relationships are able to have an impact unless they start in the receiving phase. So we really have to be willing to sit and listen to what it is that the young people or I think anybody is really thinking about the vaccine or any other controversial issue. And we have to be able to receive that information without judgment. And then that gives us the opportunity to share the information that we know has been verified, that is based on science and has evidence to back it up. And we can only believe that the trust that we've built over the time that we've been together will allow those words that we share to sink deep and resonate with the young people that we're working with. So I don't think it's inappropriate at all to challenge and kind of push back on those ideas, because I think that's what reading is about. That's why it's a social act. We're not always all going to think the same, but reading and writing gives us the opportunity to freeze thought, right? And then put it out into the public sphere and give other people a chance to respond and shape and reshape our thinking. But we have to be open to that happening on two-way streets and not on one-way streets.
Another question, and Mary says thank you. Another
Welcome,
question,
Mary.
because I know a couple of other people, and like I said, Pete included, lighting the fire and then keeping that fire lit with our youth. Because again, like I said, when they come to us, they're already dispirited, they're already broken, they've already lost jobs, they've been taken advantage of. And we know that the incarceration rate usually are children who grow up to be young adults, and their literacy rates are the lowest. So I would love to hear you talk about how to light that fire, sustain the fire, and then how do you reach out to those people where, the saddest story I find is where the parent is illiterate, the child is illiterate, and how do you walk them through? So I'm going to stop here and let you talk about the whole idea of lighting the fire, because like I said, I see all these themes in your book, and this is a read it again book. So I really love it. But talk to me a little bit about lighting a fire and keeping it lit.
So Jimmy, if you remember in my book, I tell a story about being a classroom teacher. There's a young man that was a student in my class, and I call him Malik. All the names in the book are changed. But I just remember that he had this beautiful cotton candy afro, and I taught him at the end of the day. So he would come in the classroom, his shoulders would be kind of slumped. He would sit in the far back corner. I can still see his face to this day. I would have about 5 minutes of engagement with Malik, and then he would put his head on the table and he would drift off to sleep. And so I would call home and I would talk to his mom, and our conversations were pretty much about the fact that, you know, she sent him to me so I could light that fire. That was a part of my job. She reminded me, and I understood that that was a part of my responsibility and a part of my job. But I did not know exactly what to do to get to Malik. And I'm sad to say that I never really was able to unlock what it was that would light that fire, as you talked about it, for Malik. But I understood later that I needed a different approach. When we think about classroom teachers, these are the only people where you can go into a profession where you've been an apprentice for at least 12 years. You've been watching people do the thing that you end up doing for more than 12 years. Sometimes, you know, you add another 4 onto that for college and you'll have 16 years you've been watching somebody teach in front of a classroom. So I thought that I was supposed to be like my favorite teacher in high school. But I found that those techniques, those approaches didn't really work very well. What I've learned is that I need a curriculum, I need books, I need materials that are going to connect. If I had what Malik wanted to read about and what he wanted to write about, that would have been a good start. So you can't light the fire until you're able to make a love connection between a reader and that book that has been written, that book that they can eat up, like you said, you ate up my book, Jimmy, and that just really makes me happy. And there are books out there for everybody. There is a love connection for everybody. We also have to understand that this relationship is really rooted in a history. It's not just about the moment that you sit next to that child or that adult. It's rooted not only in the history of the lifetime of that learner, but it's rooted in the history of our nation, really. So we need to keep an account. We need to not forget that we're talking to people who need to build that confidence, who need that affirmation, who need that validation to be able to take those steps forward that will light the fire. So I think it's about finding the right book. It's about knowing the interest of the learner. And then it's about affirmation, really. It's about taking into account all of our histories and making sure that's front and center in our conversations.
So next question. Next question. I know you launched your book, I believe it was August 10th, correct?
It was. Just a few days ago, we had a book birthday.
Yeah, book birthday, which was also my birthday. So I really thank you. And I took note of that. Tell me, in launching the book and having these discussions, what was the most perplexing? And this is not meant to trip you up, but what is the most perplexing question that you were asked to date? The one that made you say, I don't know the answer right now.
That's such a good question. I think that I was asked a question about what we can do at this point to support our schools or to support literacy development inside of schools. And so I offered some suggestions, but I thought about that later, and I'm thinking that I don't want to be at the point where I'm ready to give up on schools in terms of literacy instruction for the most vulnerable students. But I think I'm past the point where I feel as if reform is going to be possible. I write in the book about how the foundation of our school system goes back to white supremacy. And so I'm not 100% sure. I don't have an answer for how to really help schools do better. In some cases, we're going to have to start again. This is one of the reasons that I started my work in community centers and churches and places outside of school buildings, because just the physical structure of the building, for some learners, it just incites and elicits anxiety, right? And so that was a really hard question for me. How do we support schools in improving literacy development? I don't necessarily know the answer to that question, but I'm still trying to hammer that out and do a lot of reading and research and come across other people who are a lot smarter than me that might have the answer. But on some level, I have to call myself an educational abolitionist because we've got to do some things differently.
Yeah, and you know, I'll jump in and say, yeah, because we have shifted from that abolitionists. I love it. Advocates, we are, because we're doing all of that and we're working ourselves very thin. I read today, you know, from the Census, Census Bureau that for the first time ever, the percentage America is becoming more diverse.
Mm-hmm.
The number of quote unquote white Americans is below, I believe 56% is the lowest that it's been since I think in history or in 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is, it does bring in a call about inequity, and everything that I see in the book is about the inequity, historical inequity.
Right.
And so now with the emerging Latinos and Asians, those numbers are beginning to go up. We're seeing the literacy issue still being there, whether it's language from first generation.
Mm-hmm.
But we've got the bulk. If I live in Washington, D.C., where it's a split, we have over 117,000 people. A large number of people who are still not literate. They're below the first grade,
right,
nationwide. So with these numbers, I think, I don't want to answer this question about the disparities, but I'd love to hear what you think and what you're hearing, applying again to this great book that I love about, what's the future like? And I'm saying, what's our future like? Because I'm obviously African American, but for
right,
minorities that are coming where some of these historical issues are still happening.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So your question is about the future of literacy instruction and how you think that's going to roll out for African Americans or people of color in general, right? That's what you're asking.
Two-part question, yeah. And I would like to see, African America, because when you look at the percentage, that number is still disproportionately high when it comes to literacy. So we got to be real about that.
Yes.
But then you have this new emerging group with those same issues. They're slightly different, some of them. But let's first talk about African Americans first.
Okay, so let's talk about African Americans. And this is part of the reason that I reach back to Frederick Douglass so often, because I really feel like in reading his story, I found that learning how to read, and not just learning how to decode, but learning how to allow himself to be transformed by this learning really was the thing that changed the game for him. And so I feel like personally, literacy is going to be, it's our next frontier in terms of civil rights. So we've got to get to these young people and make sure that they understand the importance of literacy, get the books in their hands that will inspire them and engage with them. I really am feeling as if those low literacy rates, we're going to see them turn around, Jimmy. I feel that that's the case. As we continue to become invested in our communities, and as we as a nation begin to realize that we can't place all of this responsibility on our schools, knowing the limitations of our school system in general, we've got to be able to step up and say, like they did when my parents were growing up, if I've learned something, if I've gained something, it's my responsibility to now reach back for somebody else. We've got to really make that a part of our political consciousness again. We can give away backpacks and school supplies at the beginning of a school year, but to invest an hour a week in sitting next to a child and giving them the books that they love, those are going to be the things that we will need to do going forward in order to turn that number around. I feel the same way about people who are speaking English as a second language. We can engage through this model, people from all kinds of backgrounds, and we can find those people who speak Spanish as a first language to connect with the kids who are speaking Spanish as a first language in school, and just make sure that they get the kind of books that they need to practice. And so we can turn these numbers around. Did I address your question specifically, or did I dance around?
No. You addressed it very well, because I mean, it's exactly. I mean, I would definitely say especially what's compelling, turning these numbers around, because it is a numbers game. And when you look at
Yeah.
it by percentages and use groups that, they're really in it, like pro literacy and others, it's a numbers game. And
Yeah.
right now it's just not a happy story. So with that, here's the easy question, the current question. Because like I said, this book, I want copies because I've been telling people to read it. I can't get the focus on it, but I've been telling people definitely read it. But you started off with a great list of books, and I know a few people on this call, they really want to know how, their question is always going to be, how can I help the person I'm tutoring, how help the person that I'm working with? It's the most frequent question that we get. But I'm going to switch and ask you, of the current books that you're reading, what's your favorite book, or what's on your bookshelf right now that you would tell people to read?
Okay, so I am reading Cast. Actually, it's on my bookshelf right now, by Isabel Wilkerson.
Yep, Wilkerson.
And when I'm very early in this particular book, but when I read The Warmth of Other Suns, her other book, it was like, I have to describe it in the same way you described kind of reading my book. It was like eating candy. Like I just wanted more of it. The way that she was able to take the history and weave it in with the stories, I mean, I just couldn't put it down. It's exceptional. And so I definitely would recommend Isabel Wilkerson to anyone who's looking for something to read right now, either The Warmth of Other Suns or Cast.
Okay, yeah, very good. And I have an autographed copy of that. I really like that book.
Oh.
Yeah, so let's see. I think there's another question that said, I know, someone just said they noticed Cast on there, and she's reading The Warmth of Forever Songs. I think that's Mary Panetta that said that, and she said it's powerful. So
Very
I know
powerful.
we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to step back from here. And like I said, I'm thankful for Politics and Prose. Love this book, and yes, this is a book you're going to see on our website along with a couple of others. But I want to let you talk about what you want to talk about. I think we have about 2 minutes left, 2 or 3 minutes left. So I'm going to step back and give you the floor.
Well, first of all, Jimmy, I want to say what a joy it has been to have this conversation with you this evening. I'm so pleased to have gotten to know you a little bit better, and hope that this conversation will continue on some level. I'll just take a minute to say this. One of the things that really had a major impact on me was on June 17th, 2015, there was a shooting at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And that church is located about 2 hours from where I am now, about an hour from where I grew up, and about a 10-minute walk from where I went to college. And so I really have a lot of strong connections to that particular building. And when I found out what happened there, it shook me to my core. One of the reasons that I'm motivated to do the work that I'm doing is because I want our young people to know the truth about what's happening around them. And so that 100 years from now, the Emmanuel 9 or that particular day doesn't become another Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? So that our history remains something that we can keep close to us, so that we can interpret the truth and we can pass it on to our next generation, so that they're armed with the tools that they need to make sure we stay close to what this country was meant to be. We can do better, and we will do better, because we're beginning to know better. So thank you for the opportunity to tell this story.
Thank you. My only ask is I want the autographed version of the book.
Absolutely.
We need to talk more about it. I think Bashan is I hope I said his name correctly, is standing by. But Bashan, thank you very much for the opportunity. And I was like, with Tracy, you can tell I really did read this book very thoroughly, and I could talk about it all day long. And like I said, our board chair, Mary Panetta, who's standing by, this was great in the question. So Bashan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams, and thank you once again to the Washington Literacy Center for joining us with this wonderful event. To all of you out there who have joined us, thank you on behalf of Politics and Prose for attending another PNP Live. Of course, and thank our honored guest, Ms. Bailey. Please go click the link, and just in case you didn't see it, there it is again. Follow the link, purchase a copy, purchase a couple copies. And to all of you out there, we hope you all stay well and stay well read. Have a good evening, everyone.